winter wind howling off the Hudson River did not carry the scent of salt or snow, but the metallic, unforgiving chill of a city holding its breath. It was the kind of cold that slipped through the seams of heavy wool coats, settling deep into the marrow of the bones, reminding every soul walking the concrete grid of Manhattan that nature still held a veto over their ambitions. In the heart of Harlem, the streets were dusted in a thin layer of gray frost, the neon signs of the jazz clubs and late-night diners reflecting off the icy pavement like spilled paint. But inside the penthouse of the Lenox Terrace apartments, the air was warm, quiet, and thick with an unspoken tension. Ellsworth Johnson stood by the expansive glass window, looking down at the kingdom he had built with his bare hands, his intellect, and a ruthless pragmatism that had outlasted the Italian syndicates, the corrupt police precincts, and the United States federal government. To the world below, he was Bumpy. He was the godfather. He was the man who viewed the streets as a board of 64 squares, moving pawns and knights with devastating precision. But tonight, he was required to be someone else entirely. Tonight, he was required to be a shadow of himself. He turned away from the glass and walked over to the heavy mahogany valet stand. He selected a charcoal gray suit, tailored in Italy, the fabric incredibly smooth and expensive. He dressed slowly, methodically, buttoning a crisp white shirt starched to absolute perfection, and tying a silk tie of deep burgundy. He did not pack the snub-nosed revolver he usually kept holstered at his hip. He did not slip the straight razor into the inner lining of his jacket. Tonight, he was disarming himself, physically and psychologically. He was stepping out of the role of the monarch and into a costume of mediocrity. He was going to play the role of Ellsworth, the mild-mannered, retired accountant. It was a fiction constructed entirely for the benefit of one person, his daughter, Elise. Elise had grown up surrounded by the whispers, the sudden wealth, the late-night phone calls, and the lingering scent of danger that clung to her father's tailored overcoats. She had seen the respect, the fear, and the hushed reverence when he walked into a room. But instead of being seduced by the gravity of the underworld, she had been repelled by it. She wanted peace. She wanted a life where a knock on the door at midnight was just a neighbor, not a lieutenant delivering news of blood on the sidewalks. She wanted a pristine, uncomplicated existence, far away from the grit of 110th Street. And so, she had run to the manicured lawns and sweeping driveways of the affluent Connecticut suburbs. She had married Marcus. Marcus was a man built on an entirely different scale of power. He was a wealthy, upper-crust businessman, born into a lineage of old money and country club memberships. Physically, he was a mountain. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and carried 300 pounds of thick, imposing bulk. He was loud, he was arrogant, and he possessed the kind of unearned confidence that only comes from a lifetime of never being told no. When Elise introduced him to her father, she had begged Bumpy to keep his true identity a secret. She had painted a picture for Marcus of a quiet, numbers-crunching civilian father who spent his retirement reading the paper and managing modest investments. Bumpy had agreed. He had agreed because, beneath the hardened exterior of a man who had survived the darkest horrors of Alcatraz, he loved his daughter with a fierce, unconditional devotion. If playing the fool bought her happiness, he would wear the mask. "You ready, boss?" The voice belonged to Illinois Gordon, standing quietly in the doorway of the bedroom. Illinois was a man carved from the same unforgiving stone as Junie Bard and Nat Pettigrew. He was a veteran of the street wars, a man who spoke softly but carried an aura of imminent violence. Tonight, Illinois was dressed in a simple dark chauffeur's uniform, playing his own part in this elaborate suburban theater. "I am ready, Illinois," Bumpy said softly, adjusting his silver cufflinks. "Are the other boys in place?" "Yes, sir. 4 of our best. They drove up an hour ago. They'll be parked a half-mile down the road from the estate, out of sight, waiting on your signal. Though, if you don't mind me saying, boss, this whole accountant routine, it doesn't sit right with me. That boy Marcus, he looks at you like you're something he scraped off his shoe." Bumpy offered a microscopic, chilling smile. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth. "Let him look, Illinois. The arrogance of a fool is his greatest vulnerability. He sees an old man who pushed pencils for a living. He doesn't know he's inviting a man who read Shakespeare and Nietzsche in solitary confinement. Let him believe his own illusion. We are only going for the holiday dinner. We will eat the dry turkey, we will smile at the passive-aggressive insults, and we will return to Harlem before midnight." The drive north was a journey between 2 entirely different dimensions of reality. The heavy Lincoln Continental glided over the icy asphalt, the heater humming a low, steady drone against the bitter cold outside. Bumpy sat in the expansive back seat, the leather pristine and smelling faintly of expensive tobacco. He watched the transition through the tinted glass, the towering, claustrophobic brick apartment buildings and bustling, neon-lit avenues of the city gradually dissolved, replaced by towering oak trees, winding, unlit roads, and sprawling estates hidden behind wrought iron gates. This was Marcus's world. It was a world of inherited privilege, where violence was not committed with guns or straight razors in dark alleys, but with fountain pens, boardroom votes, and icy, condescending remarks across crystal-laden dining tables. The Continental turned into a long, sweeping driveway paved with crushed white gravel. The tires crunched rhythmically as they approached the residence. It was not merely a house, it was a compound, a massive colonial-style mansion with towering white pillars, a perfectly manicured winter garden, and windows that glowed with a warm, inviting, yet entirely sterile light. Illinois put the car in park and quickly stepped out to open the rear door. The freezing Connecticut air bit into Bumpy's cheeks as he stepped onto the gravel. He pulled his cashmere overcoat tighter around his shoulders, his posture intentionally slouching just a fraction of an inch, taking on the physical vocabulary of a man burdened by age and a lifetime of mundane desk work. Before Bumpy could even reach the grand oak double doors, they swung open. Marcus stood in the entryway, a massive silhouette blocking the warm light of the foyer. He was holding a heavy crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid. He wore a thick, expensive wool sweater over a collared shirt, his broad chest and massive gut straining the fabric. His face was flushed, a combination of the indoor heating and the expensive scotch he had clearly been drinking since the early afternoon. Well, if it isn't the tax man, Marcus boomed, his voice carrying an artificial theatrical cheerfulness that grated against the ears. He stepped out onto the porch, ignoring the freezing temperature, and extended a massive, meaty hand. Bumpy walked up the steps and took the hand. Marcus instantly squeezed, applying a crushing, competitive pressure designed to assert physical dominance over an older, seemingly weaker man. Bumpy, a man who possessed a terrifying amount of strength despite his age and the starvation he had endured in prison, could have easily shattered the bones in Marcus's hand right then and there. Instead, Bumpy let his own hand go slightly limp, allowing Marcus to feel the false victory of the handshake. "Hello, Marcus," Bumpy said, his voice soft, pleasant, and completely non-threatening. "Thank you for having me in your beautiful home. Oh, don't mention it, Elle. Come on in. Get out of the cold. Elise is in the kitchen burning something, I'm sure." Marcus laughed loudly at his own joke, a booming, obnoxious sound that echoed in the grand foyer. He slapped Bumpy hard on the back, a gesture that was framed as camaraderie, but was executed with enough force to deliberately knock the older man slightly off balance. Bumpy absorbed the strike, his expression remaining perfectly blank, pleasant, and vacant. Inside, the house was a monument to excessive, soulless wealth. The floors were imported marble. The walls were lined with abstract artwork that lacked any real passion or history. Everything was perfectly clean, perfectly positioned, and entirely devoid of life. Elise hurried out of the hallway leading to the kitchen. She looked beautiful, dressed in a conservative, expensive dress, but there was a tightness around her eyes, a subtle, nervous energy vibrating in her posture that Bumpy picked up on immediately. She rushed forward and wrapped her arms around her father. "Daddy," she whispered, squeezing him tight. "Hello, my beautiful girl," Bumpy murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. As he held her, his sharp eyes, honed by decades of paranoia and survival, noticed the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her hands. He noticed the way her gaze darted nervously toward Marcus, constantly monitoring the giant man's mood. The godfather's instincts flickered in the back of Bumpy's mind, a cold warning bell ringing in the distance. But the accountant suppressed it. The evening proceeded into the dining room, a cavernous space dominated by a long mahogany table set with heavy sterling silver and fine china. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological endurance. For 2 hours, Bumpy sat quietly, picking at his food, playing the role of the subservient guest while Marcus held court. Marcus drank heavily, his crystal tumbler rarely leaving his hand, refilled constantly from a decanter on the sideboard. With every drink, his volume increased, and the thin veneer of polite society began to peel away, revealing the deeply arrogant, cruel core of his personality. He dominated the conversation, bragging about his corporate acquisitions, his stock portfolios, and his country club victories. But the bragging was merely a warm-up. The true sport for Marcus, it seemed, was belittling the people at his table. "You know, Elle," Marcus said, leaning heavily on the table, pointing a thick sausage-like finger at Bumpy. "I look at a guy like you, and I just can't fathom it. 35 years, sitting at a desk, looking at other people's money, adding up columns, making sure the margins match. What kind of a life is that? No risk, no reward, just existing in the background while the real men move the world." Elise stiffened in her chair. "Marcus, please. My father worked very hard to provide for us." "Oh, I'm sure he did, sweetheart," Marcus sneered, taking a heavy gulp of scotch. "I'm sure he pushed those pencils real hard. But let's be honest, it's a sheep's life. The world out there, the real world, it's a jungle. It belongs to the lions. It belongs to men who take what they want. Men who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Elle?" Bumpy placed his heavy silver fork down on the porcelain plate. The clink was the only sound in the room. He looked across the table at the massive, sweating, red-faced man. Bumpy thought about the darkness of D-Block. He thought about the cold, damp concrete walls of solitary confinement, where he had spent 30 days at a time, surviving on watery soup and his own iron will. He thought about the men he had faced down in the alleys of Harlem, men with shanks and nothing to lose. He looked at Marcus, and he felt a profound, absolute disgust. "You are absolutely right, Marcus," Bumpy said, his voice a masterclass in feigned meekness. "I have always preferred the safety of the numbers. The numbers always add up. They follow the rules. The jungle, that sounds far too chaotic for an old man like me." Marcus let out a barking laugh of triumph, slamming his hand on the table, making the silverware rattle. "Exactly. That's what I'm saying. You gotta have the stomach for the blood, El. And frankly, looking at you, I don't think you could handle a paper cut without calling for a nurse." Elise stood up, her chair scraping harshly against the marble floor. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. I think I need to discuss the dessert arrangements with the caterers. Marcus, could you come with me to the study for a moment? We need to look at the invoices." Marcus rolled his eyes, a heavy, dramatic gesture of annoyance. "Invoices, always bothering me with the trivial garbage. Fine. Excuse me, El. Try not to die of excitement while we're gone." Marcus pushed himself up from the table, his massive frame swaying slightly from the liquor, and followed Elise down the long, dimly lit hallway toward the rear of the estate. Bumpy remained seated at the head of the long, empty table. The silence of the mansion descended around him like a heavy velvet curtain. He picked up his linen napkin, touched it to his lips, and set it down. The air in the room had changed. To a civilian, a retired accountant, it would have just been an uncomfortable dinner. But Ellsworth Johnson was a predator. He was a man who had survived a lifetime of warfare by learning to read the invisible currents of human behavior. He had spent years reading the micro-expressions of Italian mob bosses, corrupt police captains, and desperate junkies. He knew what fear looked like. He had seen it on his daughter's face all evening. It was not the fear of a woman embarrassed by her husband's boorish behavior. It was the deep, visceral, primal fear of a woman navigating a minefield, terrified of triggering an explosion. Bumpy stood up. He did not slouch. The posture of the meek accountant evaporated instantly, replaced by the rigid, terrifyingly still carriage of the king of Harlem. His face, which had been arranged in a mask of pleasant subservience for 3 hours, went completely dead. The warmth drained from his eyes, leaving behind a cold, obsidian void. He stepped out of the dining room and into the grand hallway. The thick, imported Persian runners absorbed the sound of his footsteps completely. He moved with the absolute silence of a ghost, a skill he had perfected decades ago when walking the shadows of the uptown streets. He approached the heavy, closed oak doors of the study at the end of the hall. As he drew closer, the thick wood muffled the voices, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the low, dangerous, hissing vibration of a predator cornering its prey. "You embarrassed me in front of that pathetic old fossil." Marcus's voice growled, the alcohol slurring his words, turning his aristocratic accent into a guttural sneer. "I didn't do anything, Marcus. I just wanted to stop you from insulting him." Elise's voice trembled. It was a sound that made the blood in Bumpy's veins turn to liquid nitrogen. "Please, just lower your voice. He'll hear you. I don't care if he hears me. It's my house. You're my wife. You don't ever interrupt me at my own table, you understand?" Bumpy reached the doors. He did not knock. He did not announce his presence. He simply stood there, his hand hovering inches from the polished brass handle, listening. "Marcus, you're hurting my arm. Let go of me. I'll let go when I'm damn well ready to let go, you ungrateful little..." Smack. The sound was sharp, brutal, and sickeningly loud in the confined space of the study. It was the sound of heavy flesh striking bone. It was followed immediately by a sharp gasp of pain, and the heavy thud of someone being thrown against a wooden bookshelf. Bumpy closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. In that microscopic unit of time, the world as it was ceased to exist. The pristine suburban estate, the winter snow, the charade of the mild-mannered father-in-law, all of it vanished. He was no longer in Connecticut. He was back in the absolute darkness of D-block solitary confinement. He was back in the jungles of the Harlem underworld. The lion had been starved of its true nature all evening. Now, the cage was open. Bumpy reached out, turned the brass handle, and pushed the heavy oak doors open. The study was a dark, masculine room filled with leather-bound books, hunting trophies, and the heavy stench of cigar smoke and spilled scotch. Elise was crumpled against the lower shelves of a massive bookcase, her hand clamped over her left cheek. Tears were streaming down her face, her eyes wide with terror. Marcus was standing over her, his massive chest heaving, his fist still clenched. He looked down at her with a mixture of rage and drunken satisfaction. The heavy doors swinging open drew Marcus's attention. He turned his massive, bull-like neck, his eyes narrowing as he tried to focus on the figure standing in the doorway. Bumpy stepped into the room. He did not rush forward. He did not shout. He moved with a terrifying, deliberate slowness, purposely leaving the door cracked open, just a fraction of an inch behind him. "Well," Marcus slurred, a cruel, mocking sneer twisting his lips. "Look who decided to join the real world." The accountant found some nerve. "What are you going to do, El? You going to audit me? You going to write me a strongly worded ledger?" Bumpy ignored the giant. He walked past Marcus, keeping his eyes entirely focused on his daughter. He knelt down gracefully, the expensive fabric of his Italian suit whispering in the quiet room. He gently pulled Elise's hand away from her face. A bright, angry red welt was already swelling across her cheekbone. "Are you broken, Elise?" Bumpy asked, his voice softer than a whisper, completely devoid of inflection. "No, Daddy," she sobbed, terrified not of Marcus now, but of the terrifying stillness radiating from her father. "Please, Daddy, let's just go. Let's just leave." Bumpy stood up. He smoothed the lapels of his jacket, brushing off an invisible speck of dust. He finally turned his gaze to Marcus. "You made a miscalculation, Marcus," Bumpy said. His voice was no longer the pleasant, slightly trembling tenor of the retired civilian. It was a low, smooth gravel wrapped in velvet. It was a voice that commanded empires, a severe, fundamental error in your arithmetic. Marcus laughed. It was a loud, booming, ugly sound that shook the whiskey in his glass. Listen to the pencil pusher trying to sound tough. "You're in my house, old man. You're out of your depth. Why don't you take your sniveling daughter, get back in your cheap car, and drive back to whatever pathetic little apartment you rent, before I lose my temper and break your hip?" Bumpy took one single step forward. He did not raise his hands. He did not adopt a fighting stance. He simply stood perfectly upright, his hands resting easily at his sides. "If you ever touch my daughter again," Bumpy said, his voice dropping into a register that vibrated the crystal glasses on the nearby bar cart, "I will ensure that you spend the rest of your unnaturally short life breathing through a tube, praying for a mercy that I will explicitly deny you." The threat was delivered with such absolute, chilling sincerity that, for a split second, the alcohol-fueled arrogance in Marcus's eyes faltered. But Marcus was a man who believed his size and his bank account made him a god. The hesitation vanished, replaced by a blinding, towering rage. "You threaten me?" Marcus roared, his face turning a deep, violently purplish red. "You frail, pathetic, old nobody. I am Marcus Sterling. I buy and sell men like you before my morning coffee. You think you can walk into my study and talk to me like that?" Marcus lunged. He moved with surprising speed for a man carrying 300 pounds. He closed the distance in 2 massive strides, dropping his whiskey glass to the floor where it shattered into 100 jagged pieces. He didn't throw a punch. He wanted to humiliate the older man. He wanted to break the illusion of dignity. Marcus reached out with both of his massive, meaty hands and grabbed Bumpy entirely by the throat. The sheer force of the impact drove Bumpy backward slightly, but Marcus didn't stop. Grunting with exertion, Marcus flexed his massive arms and lifted Ellsworth Johnson entirely off the Persian rug. Bumpy's feet dangled 3 inches above the floor. Marcus's thick fingers dug into Bumpy's windpipe, cutting off his air, squeezing with the desperate, ugly strength of a bully finally finding an outlet for his rage. "Look at you," Marcus spat, the spit flying from his lips and landing on Bumpy's cheek. "Look at the big, tough accountant now. You're nothing. You're weak. You have no idea how the real world works, old man. I could snap your neck right now, and my lawyers would have it ruled a heart attack before the ambulance even arrived." Elise screamed, scrambling to her feet. "Marcus, stop. You're killing him. Let him go." Black spots began to dance on the edges of Bumpy's vision. The pressure on his throat was immense, the cartilage grinding under the massive weight of the younger man's grip. Any normal man, any civilian, would have panicked. They would have kicked their legs, scratched at the massive forearms, gasped and begged for their lives. Bumpy Johnson did none of those things. Hanging in the air, slowly being strangled to death in the opulent study of a Connecticut mansion, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson simply stopped pretending. The mask of the accountant shattered completely, falling away to reveal the cold, calculating, and utterly merciless visage of the Harlem godfather. Bumpy looked down into the red, sweating, enraged face of his son-in-law, and despite the lack of oxygen, despite the crushing pain in his throat, Bumpy smiled. It was a smile that would have made the hardest killers in the Genovese family take a step backward. It was the smile of a man who had already seen the end of the chess match, 5 moves ahead, and knew that his opponent had just willingly stepped onto a landmine. Marcus's rant faltered. He saw the smile. He saw the absolute unnatural lack of fear in the older man's obsidian eyes. For the first time in his pampered, privileged life, Marcus Sterling felt a cold spike of genuine terror pierce his alcohol-soaked brain. Why wasn't the old man fighting? Why wasn't he terrified? Still suspended in the air by his throat, Bumpy slowly, deliberately shifted his gaze. He looked past Marcus's massive shoulder toward the heavy oak doors that he had left cracked open an inch when he entered. Bumpy gave a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod to the dark hallway. A shadow detached itself from the gloom. The shadow did not simply detach itself from the gloom. It seemed to consume the ambient light of the hallway, pulling the warmth of the expensive Connecticut estate into a freezing, inescapable vortex. The heavy oak doors, which had been resting ajar by a mere fraction of an inch, swung open with the agonizing, slow, methodical creak of a crypt being unsealed. Out of the suffocating darkness stepped Illinois Gordon. He was no longer playing the part of the subservient, mild-mannered chauffeur. The slumped, unassuming posture he had carried up the driveway was entirely gone, replaced by the rigid, predatory carriage of a man who had spent his entire adult life dispensing violence in the unforgiving concrete valleys of the city. He wore a heavy, dark wool overcoat that fell past his knees, the expensive fabric tailored perfectly to conceal the heavy steel of the Thompson submachine gun resting on a leather sling tightly beneath his left arm. His face was a mask of carved, immovable mahogany. His eyes, utterly devoid of any human empathy, locked instantly onto the massive, sweating form of Marcus Sterling. But Illinois was not alone. Behind him, flowing into the opulent study like black water seeping through the cracked hull of a doomed ship, came 4 more men. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized silence that was entirely unnatural for men of their considerable size. These were not loud, boastful street thugs looking to make a name for themselves. These were not corner boys fueled by cheap liquor and misplaced bravado. These were the apex predators of the uptown underworld. These were Ellsworth Johnson's elite enforcers, a vanguard handpicked for their absolute unflinching loyalty and their chilling capacity for wet work. They fanned out instantly, executing a flawless, unspoken tactical perimeter without a single syllable vibrating in the air. To the left stepped Nat Pettigrew, a towering giant of a man whose face bore the faded, jagged calligraphy of a dozen straight razor wars. He moved toward the large, floor-to-ceiling bay windows that looked out over the snowy, manicured estate, effectively blocking the only secondary exit. To the right moved a man known simply as Ghost, wearing a sharp, slate-gray fedora pulled low over his hollow eyes. Ghost positioned himself seamlessly between Marcus and the heavy mahogany desk, cutting off the billionaire's access to the heavy crystal decanters and the brass letter openers that could be used as desperate weapons. The remaining 2 men, entirely silent and possessing the dead, flat stares of graveyard statues, flanked Illinois Gordon. Their hands rested casually, yet terrifyingly, inside the deep wool pockets of their overcoats. The universal street translation for that posture was clear. They were holding steel, their fingers resting lightly on the triggers of snub-nosed revolvers, waiting only for a twitch of Bumpy's eyebrow to turn the study into a slaughterhouse. The atmosphere in the pristine upper-crust room shifted instantaneously. The heavy, intoxicating scent of expensive, aged Scotch and imported Cuban cigars was completely and violently overwhelmed by the metallic, ozone smell of impending doom. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. Marcus Sterling, holding the father-in-law he believed to be a weak, pencil-pushing civilian suspended 3 inches in the air by the throat, completely froze. The alcohol-fueled rage that had been boiling in his veins, inflating his massive chest with false, aristocratic courage, abruptly turned to ice water. His mind, accustomed entirely to the predictable, sterile safety of corporate boardrooms, country club locker rooms, and high-priced legal teams, violently rejected the visual information his eyes were currently processing. He blinked rapidly. Heavy, cold beads of sweat began to roll down his flushed forehead, stinging the corners of his eyes. Who were these men? How had they bypassed his state-of-the-art security system? How had they neutralized the private armed patrol guards circling the perimeter of the 50-acre estate without sounding a single, solitary alarm? The answers to those desperate questions did not matter. The only thing that mattered was the sheer, suffocating, gravity-altering aura of death these 5 men brought into his private sanctuary. Trembling, his massive shoulders suddenly feeling weak and hollow, Marcus looked back down at the man he was currently strangling. Ellsworth Johnson was still smiling. It was not a smile of bravado. It was not a smile of a man putting on a brave face in the presence of his saviors. It was a smile that promised absolute, catastrophic ruin. It was the smile of a grandmaster who had allowed a loud, arrogant amateur to play on his chessboard just long enough to willingly walk into an inescapable checkmate. It was the smile of a king. The sudden, horrifying realization of his own catastrophic miscalculation hit Marcus like a physical blow to the sternum. The thick, meaty, well-manicured fingers that were wrapped like iron bands around Bumpy's windpipe suddenly lost every ounce of their structural integrity. The trembling that had begun in Marcus's shoulders violently cascaded down his massive, thick arms, turning his muscles to water. He opened his hands. He dropped the old man. To Marcus's absolute, mind-bending horror, Bumpy did not collapse into a pathetic, gasping, coughing heap on the imported Persian rug. The older man landed with the astonishing, feline grace of a much younger, highly trained athlete. His expensive Italian leather shoes made a soft, perfectly controlled sound as they touched the floor. He did not stumble backward. He did not fall to his knees, clutching his bruised throat. He simply absorbed the downward momentum, straightening his posture until he stood perfectly erect, an immovable pillar of tailored wool and cold steel. The silence in the room became absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of quiet, broken only by the ragged, panicked, wet breathing of Marcus Sterling, who was now backing away slowly, his hands raised instinctively in a pathetic gesture of surrender. Bumpy reached up with his left hand and lightly touched the collar of his crisp, starched white shirt. He slowly, methodically adjusted the knot of his deep burgundy silk tie, sliding it back perfectly into the center of his collar. He then brushed his hands down the front of his charcoal gray suit jacket, smoothing out the microscopic, invisible wrinkles caused by Marcus's aggressive grip. He brushed a non-existent speck of dust from his left sleeve, examining the cufflink to ensure it was perfectly aligned. He performed these mundane, everyday actions with a terrifying, deliberate slowness. He did not gasp for air. He did not rub his neck. He breathed through his nose, long, slow, controlled breaths that regulated his heart rate back to a resting rhythm. Every single second that passed in that absolute silence was an eternity of psychological torture for the giant standing before him. Bumpy was weaponizing the quiet. He was allowing the sheer weight of the situation, the undeniable reality of the 5 armed killers standing in the doorway, to slowly and methodically crush the last remaining fragments of Marcus's arrogance into dust. Finally, when the silence had stretched to the point where Marcus felt his own heart might hammer its way out of his ribcage, Bumpy turned his head. He did not look at the sweating billionaire. He looked at his daughter. Elise was still huddled against the bottom shelf of the massive oak bookcase. Her beautiful face was stained with ruined makeup and hot tears. Her hand was still pressed tightly against the angry, swelling red welt on her left cheek. She was staring at the 5 men in the room, her eyes wide with a mixture of profound shock and a dark, terrifying, dawning understanding of who her father truly was beneath the gentle, mild-mannered facade she had forced him to wear. "Illinois," Bumpy said. His voice was a revelation. It was no longer the soft, slightly trembling, subservient tenor of the retired civilian accountant. It was a smooth, low, rumbling baritone that commanded the room with absolute, unshakable authority. There was no rasp, no weakness, no evidence whatsoever that he had just been suspended by his throat a mere 60 seconds prior. It was a voice that commanded empires. "Yes, boss," Illinois replied instantly, his voice a low, respectful rumble that vibrated in the chest. "My daughter is distressed," Bumpy said softly, his obsidian eyes softening for just a microscopic fraction of a second as he looked down at Elise. The air in this house has become foul. It is unfit for her to breathe. Please escort her to the Lincoln. Turn the heater on to the highest setting. Tell the driver to play that Sam Cooke record she enjoys so much. Stay with her. Do not let anyone, and I mean absolutely anyone, approach the vehicle until I step out of those front doors." Illinois stepped forward. As he moved, he did not look at Marcus. He walked past the massive, trembling billionaire as if Marcus were nothing more than a piece of uninteresting, outdated furniture. He reached down, offering a large, surprisingly gentle hand to Elise. "Come on now, Miss Elise," Illinois said, his tone shifting instantly from that of a hardened killer to that of a protective uncle. "Let's get you out of this terrible draft. You're shivering." Elise hesitated. She looked from Illinois' outstretched hand up to her father's face. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg, to try and bridge the impossible gap between the peaceful suburban life she had fabricated and the terrifying underworld reality that was currently bleeding all over her Persian rug. She wanted to ask him to stop. She wanted to ask him to just walk away. But the look in Bumpy's eyes stopped the words in her throat. It was a look of absolute, unconditional, terrifying love, wrapped in a barrier of impenetrable, cold steel. It was a silent, undeniable command, telling her that this was no longer a family dispute. This was no longer a domestic argument over spilled scotch and bruised egos. This was the mechanics of power. This was business, and she was not equipped to witness the audit. She took Illinois' hand and slowly stood up. Her legs were shaking. She did not look at her husband. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the polished floorboards as the towering enforcer gently led her out of the study and into the dimly lit hallway. As they crossed the threshold, Illinois paused for a fraction of a second. He looked back over his shoulder at the enforcer, standing closest to the heavy brass doorknob. "Lock it," Illinois instructed, his voice flat and dead. The enforcer nodded once. He stepped back, pulled the heavy oak double doors completely shut, and reached up, engaging the thick brass deadbolt. The sound of the heavy metal bolts sliding into place echoed in the quiet room like a gavel striking a judge's block. It was the sound of a vault ceiling. It was the sound of a point of no return. Marcus Sterling violently flinched. The sharp sound shattered the paralysis that had completely gripped his nervous system. He took a stumbling, clumsy, uncoordinated step backward, his heavy leather shoes slipping slightly on the rug. He bumped heavily into his massive, polished mahogany desk. The crystal decanter of imported scotch rattled wildly against the wood, a sharp, fragile sound in the heavy air. He was trapped. He was locked inside his own private study, deep inside his own multi-million-dollar Connecticut estate, completely surrounded by four stone-faced, heavily armed killers and an old man who was suddenly radiating the terrifying, undeniable presence of a deity. "Now, Marcus," Bumpy said softly, finally turning his full, undivided attention back to the giant. "Let us have a comprehensive conversation about the real world." Bumpy began to walk. He did not walk aggressively toward Marcus. He did not charge. He began a slow, deliberate, incredibly methodical circular pacing around the perimeter of the room. His Italian shoes made virtually no sound. He walked past the towering bookshelves, trailing a single elegant finger lightly over the leather-bound spines of the classic literature that Marcus had purchased by the yard solely for display, books he had never possessed the intellect or the patience to actually read. He walked past the expensive framed oil paintings of English hunting dogs. He was actively taking psychological ownership of the space. He was visually, methodically claiming the billionaire's territory as his own. You spoke at dinner, Bumpy began, his voice a smooth, hypnotic, rhythmic cadence that seemed to fill every dark corner of the study. You spoke at great length and with great volume about the fundamental nature of power. You spoke of lions and sheep. You spoke of the jungle and how a man who sits at a desk all day, a man who pushes pencils, cannot possibly understand the brutal mechanics of survival. Marcus swallowed hard. His mouth was entirely, painfully dry. His throat felt as though it were lined with sandpaper. He desperately tried to speak, tried to summon the booming, aristocratic, condescending voice that he used to terrify his corporate rivals in boardrooms across Manhattan, but his vocal cords completely betrayed him. All that managed to escape his lips was a pathetic, high-pitched, trembling wheeze. Look, El, Mr. Johnson, let's just be reasonable here. Let's talk about this like gentlemen." Bumpy completely ignored the pathetic plea. He did not even break his stride. He continued his slow, methodical, predatory orbit around the room. "You genuinely believe," Bumpy continued, his voice never rising above a conversational volume, "that because your last name is printed in bold lettering on the heavy stock paper of a Fortune 500 company, you are a predator." Bumpy stopped pacing near a heavy, ornate, antique globe sitting on a polished brass stand. He reached out and gave it a gentle, slow spin, watching the continents blur together under his fingertips. "You believe that because you can purchase a city councilman's vote with a campaign donation, or because you can bankrupt a smaller competing firm with a hostile, leveraged takeover, you actually know what it means to be ruthless. You confuse the soft, insulated cushion of generational wealth with actual, undeniable strength. It is a very common and very fatal misconception." Bumpy stopped spinning the globe. He rested his hand on it, stopping the world from turning, and turned his cold, dead, obsidian eyes back to the trembling giant pressed against the mahogany desk. "You are a very large man, Marcus," Bumpy said softly, taking a single, slow step toward the center of the room. "You are 300 pounds of prime, well-fed, heavily pampered beef. You grew up playing on manicured, perfectly green lawns. You attended exclusive private academies where the worst possible consequence was a strongly worded letter to your father. When you fell down and scraped your knee, there was always a highly paid private doctor to bandage the wound, and an expensive team of lawyers waiting to sue the pavement for being too hard. You have never, not for one single solitary second of your entirely artificial existence, been truly, genuinely afraid." The four enforcers standing around the perimeter of the room remained completely, utterly motionless. They did not shift their weight. They did not blink. They were a captive, silent audience to their king's masterclass in psychological dismantling. They watched the billionaire sweat, and they felt absolutely nothing. "You see, in my world, Marcus," Bumpy said, taking another slow, measured step forward, closing the distance, "power is not inherited through a trust fund. It is not handed down in a will. It is carved out of the unforgiving concrete with your bare fingernails. It is forged in the fires of places you cannot even begin to conceptualize in your worst, most feverish nightmares. You think a hostile corporate takeover is a stressful event? Try spending 30 consecutive days in the darkest hole at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. Try surviving on watery broth and a single slice of bread that the rats have already chewed the corners off of, completely isolated from the sun, just to prove to the racist guards standing outside your cell that they absolutely cannot and will not break your mind." Marcus's heavy knees finally began to give way, The sheer, overwhelming, suffocating wave of terror radiating from the older man was physically liquefying his leg muscles. He reached behind himself blindly, gripping the thick, rounded edge of his mahogany desk with both of his massive, sweaty hands just to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. His breath was coming in short, rapid, panicked gasps, his chest heaving under his expensive wool sweater. "I came into your beautiful home tonight," Bumpy said, his voice dropping a full octave, suddenly taking on a hard, metallic, unforgiving edge. "I sat at your long, pretentious table. I ate your dry, tasteless, overcooked food. I listened to your childish, pathetic, small-minded insults for 3 hours. I played the fool for you. I played the weak, subservient sheep. And I did it for one reason, and one reason only. Because my daughter, Elise, the only pure, untainted light I have ever known in a very dark, very violent universe, asked me to." Bumpy stopped walking. He stood directly in the dead center of the intricate Persian rug, exactly 10 feet away from the trembling, hyperventilating giant. He stood with perfect posture, his hands resting easily at his sides, completely relaxed, entirely in control of the universe. "And how exactly did you repay her simple, beautiful request for peace, Marcus?" Bumpy asked. The question hung heavily in the stale air, a razor-sharp, heavy guillotine blade suspended by a single, fraying thread directly over the billionaire's sweaty neck. "You struck her. You put your hands on her face." Marcus raised his hands defensively in front of his chest, shaking his massive head violently from side to side. Tears of absolute, unadulterated panic were suddenly welling in the corners of his eyes, spilling over onto his flushed cheeks. "It was a mistake," Marcus babbled, his voice cracking horribly, sounding like a terrified child trapped in a monster's body. "It was the scotch. I swear to God, Mr. Johnson, I've never done it before. I just lost my temper. The pressure at work, the alcohol, it was a mistake. Please, I'll give you anything you want. I have millions. I have offshore accounts in Switzerland. I can write you a cashier's check right now, right this second, for whatever amount you name. Just let me live." Quiet. The single word was spoken so softly it barely registered above a whisper, yet it carried the concussive, devastating force of an artillery shell. Marcus's jaw snapped shut instantly, his teeth clicking together audibly. He physically bit down on the side of his own tongue, the sharp metallic taste of fresh blood instantly filling his mouth. He froze completely, terrified that even the sound of his own breathing might trigger his execution. "Money," Bumpy said softly, a profound, deep-seated disgust violently curling his upper lip. "You offer me paper money to compensate for the spilled blood of my own bloodline. You truly are a civilian, Marcus. You truly do not understand the fundamental mechanics of consequence. You think everything in this world has a price tag." Bumpy turned away from the terrified giant. He walked slowly, gracefully, toward the massive, open stone fireplace situated on the eastern wall of the study. The thick logs had burned down to glowing embers, radiating a dull, angry, pulsing orange light from the hearth, casting long, dancing, demonic shadows across the imported white marble surround. "When a man disrespects the crown in my world," Bumpy mused quietly, staring deeply into the dying, glowing coals, his voice reflecting a sad, inevitable truth. "The penalty is absolute. It is swift, it is uncompromising, and it is entirely terminal. If you were a rival associate, Marcus, if you were a lieutenant in a different family operating in my city, you would already be dead. You would have been dead before I even stood up from the dining table. You would not even have heard the footfalls of the men who came to collect your arrogant soul. Bumpy reached out his right hand toward the heavy, ornate, wrought iron tool set resting securely on the stone hearth. He bypassed the ash brush. He bypassed the small, useless shovel. He wrapped his long, elegant, incredibly strong fingers around the cold, textured handle of the heavy iron fireplace poker. It was a beautiful, but terrifyingly brutal instrument. It was nearly 3 feet long, forged from solid, dense, black iron. It terminated in a heavy, sharply curved hook designed to physically drag and manipulate massive, burning oak logs. It weighed at least 8 pounds. It was cold to the touch, heavy and unforgiving. Bumpy lifted it effortlessly from its brass stand. He held it down by his right side, testing the balance, feeling the cold, dead density of the heavy metal resting comfortably in his grip. But, Bumpy continued, turning back toward the center of the room, the heavy iron poker resting casually against the side of his tailored suit leg. You present a very unique, very delicate diplomatic problem, Marcus. You are legally and spiritually bound to my daughter. If I allow my associates standing in this room to do what they do best, if I allow them to separate your massive head from your thick shoulders tonight, my beautiful Elise instantly becomes a widow. She would have to plan a funeral. She would have to wear black. She would have to answer questions from the police. Bumpy began a slow, terrifying, inevitable march back across the Persian rug, moving directly toward the mahogany desk. And I have deep, profound respect for the institution of marriage, Bumpy said softly, his dark eyes narrowing into cold, black, merciless slits. My own wife, Mamie, is a woman of exceptional, unmatched class. She believes deeply in the sanctity of vows. She believes in family. If I were to kill you tonight, Marcus, I would inevitably break my daughter's heart, and worse, I would disappoint my wife. And I never, ever disappoint Mamie. Marcus backed up as far as he possibly could, pressing his massive, sweaty back flat against the expensive wallpaper behind his desk. He was trying to shrink his 300-pound frame into the wall itself, trying to disappear. He was completely trapped in the narrow space between the wall and the heavy mahogany desk. There was nowhere left to run. There was no one coming to save him. So, Bumpy said, stopping precisely 3 feet away from the front edge of the desk. He raised the heavy iron poker slightly, letting the dull, pulsing orange light from the fireplace reflect ominously off the brutal, soot-stained tip. We must find an alternative solution. We must find a compromise, a way to absolutely guarantee that you never ever disrespect my bloodline again, while simultaneously keeping your pathetic black heart beating within your massive chest. Bumpy did not speak another word. He simply gave a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod to Ghost and the other enforcer standing closest to the desk. The two men moved with the blinding, terrifying speed of striking cobras. Before Marcus's alcohol-sluggish brain could even process the command, before he could raise a single hand to defend his face, the men vaulted seamlessly over the sides of the desk. They grabbed Marcus's massive, thick arms, their grips locking onto his biceps and forearms like industrial hydraulic vises. Marcus screamed, a high, piercing, undignified wail of sheer terror, and tried to thrash. He tried to use his massive weight to shake them off, throwing his shoulders left and right. It was utterly, completely useless. These enforcers regularly wrestled armed, desperate, PCP-fueled killers to the pavement in the dark alleys of Harlem. A soft, out-of-shape, drunken businessmen regardless of his impressive sheer mass, was nothing more than an unruly toddler to them. They lifted him slightly and slammed him violently, face down, onto the top of his own polished mahogany desk. The men pinned his broad shoulders down, applying agonizing, precise pressure to his joints, effectively paralyzing his upper body. "Hold his hands out," Bumpy instructed. His voice was entirely devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a surgeon asking for a scalpel. The enforcers grabbed Marcus's thick, meaty wrists. They pulled his arms forward, stretching them out flat against the smooth, polished surface of the desk. They splayed his thick fingers wide apart, pressing his palms down incredibly hard against the expensive mahogany. Marcus was sobbing openly now. It was not a quiet, dignified crying. It was a loud, wet, desperate sobbing. The tears streamed endlessly down his red, bloated face, soaking into the wood of his desk. "Please," Marcus screamed, his voice raw and tearing. "Please, God, no. Please, Mr. Johnson, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll never touch her again. I swear on my mother's life. I'll never even raise my voice. Please, please don't do this." Bumpy stepped up to the front edge of the desk. He looked down at the massive, trembling hands pinned helplessly to the wood. He thought about the angry, red, swollen welt he had seen on his daughter's cheek. He thought about the terrifying sound of her crying in the study, begging this monster to stop. He thought about the deep, lingering trauma that would infect her mind if this disease was not completely and permanently excised. He raised the heavy iron poker high above his right shoulder. The muscles in his back, forged by decades of crushing manual labor in the worst, most unforgiving federal penitentiaries in America, coiled tightly like thick steel springs beneath his expensive, tailored Italian suit. "You see, Marcus," Bumpy said softly, leaning his head forward so his face was mere inches from the sobbing billionaire's ear, ensuring his voice cut clearly through the panicked screaming. "A man who cannot physically close his fists can never ever throw a punch. A man who cannot hold a heavy crystal glass can never drink himself into a violent rage. You wanted to know how the real world works. You wanted to know the mechanics of the jungle. Class is officially in session." Bumpy did not hesitate. He did not blink. His heart rate did not elevate a single beat per minute. He brought the heavy iron poker down with a devastating, terrifying, localized velocity. The sound of solid, dense iron meeting the delicate, intricate, tightly packed architecture of the human hand was horrific. It was not a single clean crack. It was a sickening, wet, drawn-out crunch of 27 fragile bones, joints, and metacarpals shattering absolutely simultaneously under immense pressure. Marcus unleashed a scream that tore violently at his vocal cords, a primal, animalistic shriek of absolute, unfiltered agony that echoed deafeningly off the high ceiling of the study. His massive body violently convulsed against the desk, his legs kicking wildly backward, his expensive shoes scuffing the wood paneling, but the enforcers held his shoulders and wrists down with immovable, stone-like precision. Bumpy did not stop. His face remained perfectly calm, a terrifying mask of cold, methodical administration. This was not a crime of passion. This was an incredibly precise, necessary structural demolition. He raised the poker again. He brought it down on the right hand a second time, targeting the thick wrist joint, ensuring the complex carpals were ground into absolute, irreparable dust. The sound was sickening, a wet, pulpy thud against the blood-smeared mahogany. The heavy iron hook bit deep into the flesh, tearing the skin. Marcus's screams began to lose their air, turning into choked, guttural, wet gurgles of shock as his nervous system became completely overloaded with pain signals. His eyes rolled back into his head, showing only the whites. Bumpy stepped calmly to his left. He adjusted his grip on the iron handle. He raised the poker a third time. He brought it down with pinpoint, ruthless, devastating accuracy directly onto the center of Marcus's left hand. The heavy iron hook completely shattered the knuckles, splintering the bones into 100 jagged microscopic fragments. He raised it a fourth, final time and brought it down like a blacksmith's hammer on the left wrist. It was over in less than 15 seconds. Bumpy slowly lowered the iron poker. He dropped the heavy iron poker, letting it fall heavily onto the Persian rug beside the desk with a dull, sickening thud, making sure not to stain his shoes. He looked down at the desk. Marcus's hands were no longer hands. They were entirely pulverized, misshapen, violently swelling masses of purple flesh, torn skin, and completely shattered bone resting limply on the wood. They would never, ever heal properly. Even with the best, most expensive orthopedic surgeons his millions could buy, Marcus Sterling would spend the rest of his natural life struggling merely to hold a silver spoon. He would never be able to grip a golf club. He would never be able to comfortably hold a steering wheel. He would never be able to sign his name to a hostile takeover document. And, most importantly, he would never ever be able to clench his fingers into a fist again. The physical threat to Elise had been permanently, surgically neutralized. Marcus was gasping for air in shallow, ragged bursts. His face was ghostly pale, completely drained of color, and covered in a thick, cold sweat. His body was rapidly going into severe clinical shock. He turned his heavy head slowly, his tear-filled, wide, terrified eyes looking up at the impeccably dressed man standing over him. The aristocratic arrogance was completely, utterly gone. The powerful corporate billionaire had been entirely erased from existence. All that remained on the desk was a broken, terrified, weeping creature who finally understood his true place in the food chain. Bumpy reached into his inner breast pocket and retrieved a crisp, perfectly folded, monogrammed silk handkerchief. He carefully, methodically wiped a single tiny speck of blood from his silver cufflink and then dabbed a bead of sweat from his own forehead. He folded the silk and placed it back into his pocket. "You can let him up," Bumpy said quietly to his men. The two enforcers instantly released their crushing grips and stepped seamlessly back into the shadows near the walls, their faces completely impassive. Without their support, Marcus slid wetly off the side of the mahogany desk. He collapsed heavily onto his knees on the floor. He instinctively tried to bring his ruined hands to his chest to cradle them, but the slightest movement sent waves of blinding agony radiating through every nerve in his body. He let his arms hang limply at his sides, sobbing uncontrollably, his tears mixing with the blood on the floorboards. He walked slowly, deliberately toward the kneeling, weeping giant. He stopped just inches away, the toes of his Italian shoes nearly touching Marcus's trembling knees. He looked down at the broken man from a great height. "You will tell the emergency room doctors at the hospital that you had a terrible accident in your garage tonight," Bumpy said. His voice was cold, flat, and absolute. It was a decree, not a suggestion. "You will tell them that a heavy engine block slipped from its suspension chain while you were working under it. You will spend the next few months in agonizing, incredibly frustrating physical therapy. And when you finally return home to my daughter, you will speak to her with the utmost reverence, using the soft, polite tone one uses when addressing royalty." Marcus squeezed his eyes shut tightly, nodding violently. his chin trembling so hard his teeth clicked together. "Yes," he choked out, his voice barely a whisper through the pain. "Yes, I swear to you, I understand." Bumpy leaned down slightly, bending at the waist until his face was level with Marcus's. His obsidian eyes locked onto Marcus's terrified gaze, refusing to let the broken man look away. "Because if I ever hear a single rumor," Bumpy whispered, the absolute promise of death hanging heavily in the cold air, "if I ever hear a whisper on the wind, if I ever sense for a fraction of a second that my daughter is unhappy in this house, I will not come back with an iron poker, Marcus. I will come back with a straight razor, and I will ensure that my men leave your pieces scattered from this estate all the way down to the bottom of the Hudson River. Do we have an absolute understanding?" Marcus sobbed loudly, pressing his sweaty, bruised forehead flat against the cold wooden floor in a gesture of total, absolute, undeniable submission. Yes, I understand." Bumpy stood up perfectly straight. He smoothed his burgundy tie one final time, adjusting his jacket so it hung flawlessly from his shoulders. The lesson was completely over. The surgery was a success. The patient had survived, but he would never be the same. "My name is not Ellsworth, the retired accountant," Bumpy said softly, his voice echoing in the quiet devastation of the study, addressing the weeping man on the floor. The words carried the heavy weight of history, the blood of the Harlem streets, and the absolute, undisputed sovereignty of the Uptown Empire. "My name is Bumpy Johnson. I am the king of Harlem. And you have an incredibly pleasant evening, Marcus." Bumpy turned his back completely on the broken billionaire. He did not look back. He did not need to. He walked slowly, with immense grace and quiet power, toward the heavy oak doors. The enforcers standing by the exit disengaged the thick brass deadbolt with a sharp clack, then pulled the door wide open. Bumpy stepped out into the dimly lit hallway, leaving the heavy stench of blood, spilled scotch, and completely shattered arrogance far behind him. The four enforcers immediately followed in his wake, dissolving seamlessly back into the shadows from which they came, moving with the silence of ghosts. They left Marcus Sterling entirely alone in the bleeding wreckage of his own making, kneeling on the floor, desperately trying to comprehend the sheer, terrifying magnitude of the monster he had so foolishly invited into his home.
Thanks for listening, folks. If you liked that video and want more, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any Bumpy Johnson stories.